Well, hey there, friends. Welcome back to the Christian Marriage Podcast, coming to you here from the backyard. And a beautiful evening to record this, so I hope that you're having a great evening, especially since you're probably planning your wedding if you're watching this. So in this episode tonight, I want to talk about the elements of the wedding service, or as I've been calling it throughout the podcast series so far, the covenant service, which is really what it is. It's a covenant service. You're entering into covenant with another person, therefore covenant service. And especially in a Christian marriage, it's a vow taken before God, covenanting certain promises to another person. So it's a holy thing that you're doing when you take this vow, when you make this service, and you enter into covenant, and it's a lifetime deal. Anyway, so I want to talk about the elements tonight and the parts of the service. And the reason why I want to do that is because I think that because we have so many people doing services now, so many folks other than ministers doing the service, we're losing elements because you don't have anybody with a firm hand to say, no, this must be a part of your covenant ceremony. So because they don't know, because they don't have the information, you might ask your friend, you might ask, a coworker, you might ask a family member to do the service, and they might be like, well, I don't know what I'm doing, and they just do what they maybe think is right. Well, there are certain elements that you really need to have in the service, and I want to talk about those. And just a little housekeeping. This is probably going to go just a tiny bit longer than the other podcasts, so just a little bit longer, maybe up to about, 20 minutes, 15 minutes, because there's so many things I feel like I need to say. So let's kick it off. First of all, we want to start with the processional. This is always a very important part, and it's important to the bride because she's featured here. She's featured actually in quite a bit of the wedding service. But the processional is really the time when she is front and center. So in the processional, you have the men come out first, and they stand at the altar or at the front of the hall, wherever you're having your service. And they're lined up just like they're going to be lined up. You have the groom, the best man, the groomsman. And right next to the groom, standing just behind him, is the pastor or the minister who's doing the service. Then you have the ladies come in to the hall, and you start with the last in line first. So the first bridesmaid comes in, she walks all the way down the aisle, turns to her left, and lines up opposite the last man in the line, and then so forth and so on until you come to the bride. And of course, sometimes there'll be ring bearers and flower girls and so forth. That's always a precious time. You don't have to have that though. You can be without a ring bearer or a flower girl. But of course, then the maid or matron of honor precedes the bride down the aisle, and she stands just to the left of the bride, and then the bride comes. Now the bride is escorted. She's not going to come down by herself, and she's escorted by her father, who's on her right side. The father brings the bride down to the front, and he stands between the groom and the bride. So if you're looking at the front, you have the groom on the right, and you have the bride on the left as the audience is looking to the front. And then the father stands in the middle between the two. So he's standing there, and he's still holding on to her as they arrive at the front of the auditorium or the room or the hall, wherever you are. So then you see all the way across, you have the bridesmaids up to the maid or matron of honor, the bride, the father. Behind the father is the pastor or the minister. And then you have the groom, the best man, and the bride and the groomsman going across the front. Let me just say a real quick note about the best man and the maid or matron of honor. They're like the sergeants of their little groups. Whatever the groom needs, that's the best man's job. He's there to take care of any need whatsoever. And he commands the groomsmen. So if the groom needs something, he says to groomsman number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, however you have, he says to one of them, or to all of them, or to several of them, hey, I need you to take care of this. The groom needs it. That's their job. They're to protect him. They're to do what he needs. They're to provide for him. Their job is to focus on that groom. Now, the groomsman, especially the best man, his job in the wedding service is to act as a witness. So he's the witness. The rest of the crowd, the groomsmen, the bridesmaids, all the people that are in attendance, the pastor, the musicians, whoever else you have there in the room, they are not witnesses. They are there witnessing what happens, but the two witnesses to this event are the best man and the maid or matron of honor. Same is true for the matron of honor. She is there, or the maid of honor. She's there to make sure that the bride's needs are met. And she is the sergeant over all of those maids there, all of the bridesmaids. So whatever the bride needs, the maid of honor tells the rest, and they get it done. So they're there to keep her, to watch over her, to protect her. They're to keep people away from her. And in certain situations, the maid of honor can go to the best man and employ his service for whatever needs to be done for the bride. That's how important she is. She can even call away the best man and the groomsmen to do something for the bride if she wants. So out of those two, the maid or matron of honor is the most important in that group. And then you have the bride, the father, and the groom standing before the altar, and the pastor is standing there at the altar. The very first thing that happens when everyone arrives to the front is there's an opening prayer. This is for a Christian marriage. If you're not having a Christian marriage, then you don't have to have an opening prayer if you don't want to. But a Christian marriage should always open with prayer. The pastor or the minister performing it should be the one to have that prayer. Nobody else needs to have that prayer, because right then and there, once everybody arrives at the altar, that's it. It's all set. Everyone's in place. No one else now is going to be involved unless the bride or the groom has appointed it. But the pastor is the one to lead that prayer. After the prayer, he does the opening. Now, the opening is, and let me just say this too, you might be, I'm Protestant and I'm Baptist, so my experience is colored by those those events, those things, that theology. So you might be Catholic, and what I'm about to go through is the elements of the service. You might say, well, that's not what my pastor says. He says there's something else added to it. So I'm going to go through the basics of the service. Your pastor or your minister might say, okay, but also we need to add this X, Y, or Z. Okay, but these are just the basics, okay, for Protestant service. So the opening prayer, I always love to use the dearly beloved. We're gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Okay, I really like that opening. I usually don't include in my opening, if there's anyone present here today who objects to this union, let them speak now, forever hold their peace. I usually don't do that, just because they don't really, once you're at the altar, it's too late. If you had objections, you should have made those objections known prior to the service. You've had plenty of time to object. So if you're at the service, I'm sorry, friends, once everybody's up there in the front and they're all in their place and the wedding is initiated, it's too late. I don't ever use that. So the opening takes place, and then you have the question. All right. So the question is, and you always begin with the man. You will say, hey, Daniel. Let's just say the man's name is Daniel. Hey, Daniel. Of course, you don't say hey. You should say Daniel. Daniel, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forth, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, blah, 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 till death do us part. No, blah, blah, blah is not a part of it, but you understand what I'm trying to do there, shorten it. So you would say that's the first question. And then the man answers, I will, because you asked the question, will you? Then you turn to the lady, the bride, and you say, will you have Daniel to be your lawfully wedded husband to have and to hold from this day forth? And so forth. And then she answers, I will. Now, once the questions have been asked, you're locked in to the covenant ceremony, because these are covenant questions. These are the questions of intent. Will you have her to be your lawfully wedded wife? You're not there to buy car parts. You're not there to gawk at dresses or at men's suits or to look at the pretty stuff. It's not a part of it. So you're now locked into the covenant service, because this is all about the joining of these two people. And so you're asking the questions. Their intentions are they will. Now, the father's still standing there, and he's still between the groom and the bride. So the question now comes to him, who gives away this woman? So the father now has an opportunity to announce his intention and his blessing upon this union, because a union has now been announced. The question's been asked, the intentions have been answered, and so the father now says, okay, I'm here for this, I'm ready for this, I want this to happen, and he gives his blessing. So who gives this woman away to be married, to be joined in marriage to this man? The father says, I will. Her mother and I do. Her family does. It doesn't really matter what he says, and you can be creative here. And also the father, then I always give the fathers lots of leeway, lots of rope, because I want them to be able to, in that moment, turn to his daughter, kiss her, hug her. Of course, she probably doesn't want to kiss and hug too much because she's all dolled up. She's so beautiful. But daddy is, he's not going to lift her veil to do it, So he's going to maybe say a few words to her right there. Not a lot. I mean, he doesn't have a prepared speech. Just, I love you, be a good wife, just something like that. So dad says what he's going to say, kisses, hugs the bride. And then I usually have the father put the bride's hand into the hand of the groom. And then in that way, what you have is, again, the approval of the family for the wedding, because the bride is actually leaving the father's house and becoming the wife of a man of another house. So she's going to change her name. She's going to raise a family that doesn't belong to the family that she came from. So it's all very important and significant, and it's important for the father to show that moving from one family to the next. Okay, so the father gives away the bride. Now, at this point in a Christian marriage, you're probably going to have the sermon. This is when I would preach the sermon. The sermon comes after the father has given away the bride. The two people, after they've been standing facing me like this, and then the father gives away the bride, and now they're facing one another, or they're side by side, sort of angled and facing me, because in a moment when they do their vows, they're going to face one another. So they're side by side, maybe holding hands. The groom might have his hand on hers, whatever. But they're facing the pastor. I'll preach the sermon, and I preach it. It's like I preach any sermon. So I tell them, that this is going to be just like any other sermon I preach. It could be 20 minutes, could be 25 minutes, could be longer. I warn them, because depending on the service, sometimes I might go a little long, but I intend for them to stand there the whole time that I preach that message, because it's a Christian service, and we need to celebrate and honor Christ in that service. That's what's most important about this marriage service, is honoring and making much of the Lord Christ, because the wedding service represents the marriage between Christ and his church. So we need to recognize that, and that's the pastor's job. That's why it's important to have a pastor or minister to do it. Now look, I know that it's chic today and it's popular today to have anybody and everybody do a service. I chafe against that because it is a Christian worship service. You need to have a pastor do the service. And look, don't go out and get somebody who's got a degree or some sort of a license from the Universal Church of Light or something that they got online. You don't need to do that. If you don't have a pastor, go find a pastor. Ask them to do the service. Become acquainted with a pastor locally that if you don't have one, you could have, because he will do the service for you. So the pastor will preach the service, at this point, a sermon, and it'll probably be a sermon about marriage and the love of Christ. Also right here, you might have some music. You can have music before the sermon. I've seen music before the sermon and after the sermon. So it just depends on how much music you want. I also have seen music, special music, with a soloist or maybe an accompanist played right before the processional. So some sort of special music right before the processional. Special music can happen right here before the sermon and after the sermon. It just depends on what you want and who you can get. And you don't have to have music at all. But I have seen services where that has happened. After the sermon and whatever music that you might want to have there, you'll have the vows. Here's where I have the couple turn and face one another. Join right hands, because that's how we'll make a covenant with one another. We join right hands with each other, and she'll have to give up her flowers to her maid of honor. She'll turn back to the groom, join right hands, and I always tell them, they've been looking at me the whole time, but now I tell them, okay, now you're going to turn and look at each other. Look at each other, and that's because you're making your vow to your future mate, not to me. So you're going to say these words. And then I go real slow with the vows. And I'll say, repeat after me, and again, we begin with the man. I, Daniel, take thee, Lois, to be my wedded wife, and so forth. So now he's swearing an oath. This is a vow that he's taking. And, well, as a matter of fact, I brought with me, let's see, let me use this one. This is a marriage manual. Then I have several of these, by the way. I have this one. I have a Cokesbury marriage manual. This is printed back in the 1920s. I have one in my library that's 1879, I think. But here's a Baptist service. So in the vows here's the Cokesbury manual. In these vows, and I love these vows, I take thee to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part, according to God's holy ordinance, and thereto I pledge thee my faith. Okay? Thereto I pledge thee my faith. This is his faith expressed to her. Okay? Now she's going to say the same thing to him. This is a swearing of an oath, and you're doing it in the presence of God and before witnesses. So there are people that see this, that acknowledge this, and that will hold you to this, and you're doing it before God. And so remember that vow keeping is a very significant part of the Christian life. When we do this, when we stand at an altar and we make these vows to one another, it's an ancient tradition that goes back centuries upon centuries. So it's very significant. It should be a holy moment for you as you take your vows. After the vows come the rings, and usually I'll ask the question, do you have a gift that signifies these vows? And the man, always begin with the man, he'll say, I bring a ring, and he'll turn around and get the ring from whoever has the ring. And that's always an issue. Sometimes the ring is with the ring bearer, sometimes the ring is with the best man, sometimes the ring has been given by the best man to one of the groomsmen to hold. But the ring will come out if it hasn't been lost. And I've seen that happen. The ring will come out. He'll hold the ring in his trembling hands. And I'll tell the man, place the ring on the third finger of her left hand and repeat after me. And again, he's to look at her when he says these words, "With this ring I thee wed." So promises have been made, and now the gift is given. So the gift comes into play here, and the gift is usually a ring. It could be anything, but usually it's a ring, because rings represent the eternality of love and the permanence of marriage. And so he'll place the ring on her finger, and he'll say the words, "With this ring I thee wed," and so forth, and promise you my trust. Again, it's the faith that is sworn to. She does the same thing, places the ring on his third finger of his left hand, and then she pronounces her blessing on the ring. "With this I wed you." Okay, so they've made promises. Well, first they answered the question, their intention. Then, after listening to my boring sermon, they turn to each other and they swear their vows, promises to one another for life. And then they give rings, which are the tokens of the vows. So every time you see a wedding band on someone's hand, this is the token of vows. I took this ring the day I married my wife. It's the token of the vows that I made 38 years ago. Okay? So that's what the wedding ring represents. So it's the token of the vows. It's a very important part of the service. Now, after the rings, we have usually music. Sometimes not. It can be here. There can be a soloist or an instrumentalist that plays here. Sometimes the Lord's Supper is taken. The couple will go beyond where the pastor is standing, behind him, to receive the Lord's Supper. And usually they'll give it to one another, or perhaps the pastor will administer it to them. And sometimes you'll have a unity element, whatever it might be, a candle, sand. There are so many different unity elements today. You can choose from just about anything as a unity element. So these are all things that can happen in the service. They're not necessarily, I wouldn't call any of that an important part of the covenant service. The most important parts of the covenant service is the question, the vows, and the rings. Those are the most important elements. And then for a Christian service, you have to have prayer. You have to have, if you're going to have music, it has to be godly, Christ exalting, and you need to have a pastoral message, some sort of homily, something to connect what's happening at the altar with the church and Christ. And to remind the two at the altar of their duties, because they've just, or they're about to take their vows. After the music, the Lord's Supper, the unity element, whatever you have after the rings, then there is the pastoral prayer. And this, again, another reason why you want to have a pastor there to do this. You want his blessing on the couple. You know, they've come before him, so he's the one who now lays his hands on them. He can literally or just figuratively lay his hands on them and give a blessing in a prayer. And then after the prayer, he will turn and face the couple to the audience. The bride will get back her flowers from the maid of honor. And then after she's set, it's the bridesmaid's, the maid of honor's job to make sure the dress is straight, the veil is straight, the gown is, fluffed, and that's the maid of honor's job. Or she can appoint somebody else to do that. She can be holding the flowers and tell the other bridesmaids, "Hey, do this." But that's their job, to get her ready. Once they're facing a congregation, hand in hand, arm in arm, with her flowers, then the pronouncement, then the pronouncement is made. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to present to you Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so." And of course, sometimes the pastor will say, licensure of the state, or the duty and honor of the church, or something like that. But for example, let me read to you from the Cokesbury Manual, the pronouncement. "For as much as Daniel and Lois have consented together in holy wedlock, and have witnessed the same before God in this company, have hereto given and pledged their faith to the other, and have declared the same by the joining of their right hands by the gift of rings, I pronounce that they are husband and wife, In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Those who God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. So that would be the pronouncement. I present to you Mr. and Mrs. at the end of that. And then I would say to the man, you may kiss your bride. He would then kiss her. And of course, he's lifting her veil if she has on a veil, and then he's kissing her. After that is done, then you have the recessional, which is the opposite of the processional, and everybody flows out of the auditorium. The last element to a covenant service is the meal, and that will be taken care of course, at the hall, wherever the meal is going to be addressed. So you would put that later on in this, at the end of the service. The meals for the husband and wife, they're going to have that, the joining of the arms as they take the bite of the cake, as they take the drink. It's symbolic, and it's symbolic with importance because it represents the covenant that they've just struck and celebrates this brand new family that is now in the world. It's never been here before. So it's brand new. It's this covenant marriage. So after the recessional, you have the meal, and then you're, then the party part. And we talked about the party a little bit. And any really part of this can take over. The dress, the importance of the dress, the rings, the unity element. I've seen brides stress over the unity element. I've seen them stress over the music. I've seen them stress over every single part, because sometimes these things can, they can destroy. The little things can destroy the important things. We can get stressed over all the little things. Don't let the little things stress you out. Focus on what's important. And that's another reason why you need a pastor. You need a minister of the gospel to help you through this in a Christian wedding, a Christian marriage, because he will be able to help you understand the important elements and not to stress over the little things. I know you've been dreaming about this day, bride, since you were a little girl, but it doesn't have to be perfect. And guess what? It won't be. Things will go wrong. You need to resolve right now that something will go amiss at your wedding, because it will. But you know what? At the end of the day, if you've answered the question, if you've said your vows, if you've exchanged rings, if you've had that wedding meal, if the pastor has pronounced his blessing over you and presented you to a company of people as husband and wife, all of that is your marriage. You're married. Now, I know you want it to be perfect and beautiful and unique and all the rest, but remember, your job in a Christian wedding is to honor Christ. So let's put him first in all things. Stress about what's important and not what's about, and don't stress over the little things. I know that's hard to do, but trust Pastor Dave. Trust Pastor Dave. Don't stress over the little things. Do what you can. Do what you can and leave the rest to the Lord. Okay. Well, I have gone long with this piece tonight. So I hope that this helps. If it has, leave me a comment on the YouTube page, and I'll be glad to respond to it. And next time, I forget what the next one is. I've forgotten. Well, next time we'll have another Christian Marriage podcast, probably next Tuesday. So I hope to see you then. God bless you guys. Bye.